Hi, everyone. We are going to move on to talking about another key part of Freud's theory, and that is a way to understand personality through the interpretation of dreams, which was a major part of his theory. So I'm going to just talk about a couple concepts that he discussed, and then I'm going to teach you how to interpret your own dreams if you so desire. So, Freud referred to dreams as the royal road to the unconscious. He felt like dreams were the most direct route that we could access to understanding what's in our unconscious. But the thing about it is that dreams don't usually mean what they seem to mean. So, Freud distinguished between two different parts of the dream, the manifest content and the latent content. So the manifest content or what actually happens in the dream. So if you dream you're flying, or you dream you're late to an exam, or you dream you're running or falling off of something, that's the manifest content. He wasn't really interested in that. He was interested in the hidden symbolism behind the dream, what he called the latent content, which is the symbolic meaning. So, for example, oftentimes if you dream that you are late to something, that usually reflects some kind of anxiety that you have going on. When you dream about family members, oftentimes that's just a reflection of just thinking about how much they mean to you. So, the thing about it is that you can find all kinds of books on how to interpret your dreams. Chocolate cake means this and flying means this. But what I want to stress to you is that only you can interpret your dreams. Now, Freud was an analyst, so he felt like he had these ideas of certain kind of symbols that meant lots of things. For example, one of the central concepts in his theory was penis envy and castration anxiety, and so he felt like a lot of dreams were reflective of that. So whatever you're dreaming, it's really reflecting something in the unconscious. And really what this is a form of displacement. So it's taking unconscious thoughts, memories, feelings, and they are being expressed in a way that feels safer to us. Some people put a lot more stock in dreams than others. There are some who believe that they are just strictly biological events and don't mean anything more than that. And other people who really believe in the symbolism. I am a big believer in the symbolism. So this doesn't mean that I look to dreams or I think people should look to dreams to make big decisions in their life, but I do think they have some meaning and they can help you understand situations that consciously you may not be able to. So attached somewhere here in this there on Blackboard, I'm going to attach a worksheet that gives you some indications on how to interpret your own dreams. So I'm just going to kind of walk you through the steps here right now if you want to pull that handout up. The first thing to do is when you have a dream to write down immediately everything you can remember. And lots of people swear that they never dream, but we actually dream multiple times a night. Everybody dreams every night. But the reason we sometimes can't remember our dreams or think we don't dream is because we really wake up at the wrong time in our sleep cycle. We cycle through lighter stages and deeper stages of sleep. We tend to dream in the deeper stages. So if you wake up more likely in the lighter stages, you're not going to remember a dream. So the trick, if you want to try and remember your dreams and maybe do some analysis of it, is this, and it takes some motivation. Not everybody wants to do this, but it's to keep a pad and a pencil, or you could just reach for your phone. And when you wake up with a vivid dream in your mind, write down everything you can remember, all the details, and don't wait, even if it's 3 o'clock in the morning, because by morning time, it's probably going to be gone. And if you swear that you don't dream or you really have trouble remembering them, one trick is to set, and you got to be motivated to do this, but to set the alarm on your phone for different times during the night. So let's say you go to bed, let's say you usually fall asleep around midnight. Set your alarm for about 2 or 2:30, and that will probably wake you up in a deep sleep cycle and you're more likely to remember a dream. If not, set it again for another hour and a half or so. So that's just for those who are highly motivated. So you write down all the elements of your dream. The next thing you do is read over what you've written and pick out some key words that seem to stand out to you. So in the example that I am posting for you, it's going to say rocking chair. So maybe there's a rocking chair in your dream and that word stands out to you. So pick 3 or 4 of those key words, maybe race car or maybe something smaller like a color, green. Then what you're going to do for each of those 3 or 4 words is just do some free associating. And so say the word to yourself and then say the first thing that comes to mind afterwards. So rocking chair, old, rocking chair, squeaks, rocking chair, comfortable, and write down 3 or 4 associations to each of those 3 or 4 words. And then just read over those associations and circle the ones that seem to stand out to you or seem to be most powerful. And this isn't something that anybody can tell you how to do. It really is kind of an intuitive process, but I promise you, certain associations will stand out to you and it'll make sense. And then the last thing you do is look over all those associations that you've circled. So you've circled maybe 4 or 5 or so. Think about what's been going on in your life lately, the kinds of things that you've been concerned about, things that are troubling you, wonderful things that have happened. And the dream will start to make sense. And like I said, it may not give you direction in making a decision or such, and probably dreams aren't the best thing to hold on to, but especially this is powerful if you have a recurring dream, a dream that seems to occur for you just every so often in the same kind of way. And those probably do have some meaning, and people are often very curious. So I would be very interested if any of you try this method, if it works for you. Please let me know. You don't have to tell me the contents of the dream, but I'll be curious if you give this a try and how it works. So I'll put a little bit more information on the handout. And this is really a good way, I think, to interpret your dreams, because only you can interpret your dreams best. Only you know what's in your mind. Only you have real access to your unconscious mind. And so the books and the people that write and say, well, if you dream this, it means this, that's not necessarily true. So give that a try. Okay, we're going to move on to discussing one of the other major parts of Freud's theory, his stages of psychosexual development. And this is the part of his theory that tends to be the most controversial and the most disputed. Freud was absolutely hated when he came out with this part of his theory. He was called a pervert, he was called obscene, because it has to do with sexuality and children and instincts. It really remains the most controversial part of his theory, and in some ways the part of his theory that has been the least shown to be true through scientific research. However, it's definitely the most interesting part of his theory and very revealing and very insightful in many ways. So I'm going to go over just the main points of these psychosexual stages. I would encourage you to read a little bit more in your book to fill in some of the details on this. Okay, so let's first of all talk about what this word means. What does psychosexual mean? That's a word that you don't hear anywhere else really but Freud's theory. So the way to think about it is that we've talked about the libido. That's the life energy that we have, the psychological energy. And development occurs because this libido basically moves throughout our body looking for gratification and satisfaction. Remember, the libido comes from the id, which is constantly looking for satisfaction. And so as you get older and mature, the libido basically wanders to different areas of your body and looks for gratification. And these bodily areas are called erogenous zones. Now, when we hear the term erogenous zone, you automatically put a sexual connotation to it. And even though Freud's theory talks about sexuality, it's not so much in the strict sense that we think about it now. It's more of a general life-giving energy. There was definitely a sexual component to it, but not quite as strict as many people think. So the erogenous zones are simply a part of the body where the inner and the outer skin join. These are areas that give human beings pleasure. So the mouth, for example, that's the very first one when you're a baby. The genital area, as we're going to talk about. So we'll get into that, but those are considered erogenous zones. So the psyche, the libido, moves through the body at different ages, looking for gratification at each of the different erogenous zones. So because it's driven by instinct, psychological development is actually biological in terms of its basis. The instincts are biological, and so that instinct, the libidinal instinct, constantly is seeking gratification at the different erogenous zones. Some of the erogenous zones, like the mouth, like the picture of this guy smoking, remains a primary erogenous zone throughout our entire life. And we talked about this in class a little bit. You know, who doesn't get pleasure out of eating? Or when you're nervous, you might chew on the end of your pen or chew on your nails, something like that. So in Freud's mind, this is normal part of development, and we have adult personality problems when this goes awry. So specifically, as the libido goes to different erogenous zones, if it gets too much or too little gratification at a particular erogenous zone, then we have personality problems, and specifically adult personality problems. I will talk about that a little bit more specifically when we get to each of the stages, but just know that psychological disorders and personality problems happen when there is too much satisfaction or too little satisfaction at each of their erogenous zones. Okay, so how do these problems with gratification occur? What happens here? There's two ways. First of all, if the parents don't respond quickly enough, then a child's needs are not going to be met. And this results in what's called frustration. So, for example, if a child wants to suck on something, but the parent refuses to give them a pacifier, or is slow to nurse the baby, or to give the child a bottle. So if they don't feed them as often and they're not given a chance to gratify these needs, then the child may be frustrated. So think about a baby screaming, they want food, and they're frustrated because their needs aren't getting met. Or another way that the personality problems can develop is if the parents just allow too much gratification and stimulation. And that can happen. This is what's called overindulgence. So kids are given very little challenge to master internal functions. So for instance, a child who is still sucking on a baby bottle when they're 5 or 6, well past the typical time for that, we would consider overindulgence. Freud would consider overindulgence kids who suck their thumbs past 2 or 3, or still have a pacifier past that particular age. So a way to think about it is that the libido is allowed to enjoy itself too much at that particular erogenous zone. So the result of either frustration or overindulgence for the child are two psychological conditions, both of which are problematic, called fixation or regression. So fixation tends to occur when the id is just not ready to move on. It's stuck at a stage. Your psychic energy, the libido, is just having such a good time at that particular stage that it really doesn't feel like it has much of a need to go on. Or if the child doesn't resolve a particular crisis, it may be fixated. So two examples here, and we'll use the oral stage here. So if a parent takes a pacifier away from a child or tries to wean them too soon from the bottle onto solid food, that may result in frustration. A child's oral needs aren't being met enough, and so they may become fixated at the oral stage. Or if the child is allowed to have a bottle or nurse way past the typical age, this is according to Freud, there's some cultures that believe differently, then the child may be fixated. They have no reason to move on. Now, the problem with this is that fixations can result in regressions. So if fixations are severe enough, they really become weak points to which the personality retreats under stress. So that's why as adults, when we're stressed or we've got problems, we eat or we drink or we chew on things. So Freud believed that oral area just really remained a primary erogenous zone for the rest of our life, and to some extent we all regress to the oral region if we're stressed or upset. So that kind of thing is really very common. Now here's the thing. Freud had a lot to say about how parents could screw up their kid. Okay, if you take the bottle away too soon, they're going to be screwed up. If you let them have it too long, they're going to be screwed up. But Freud really didn't provide guidelines for how to do it correctly. He just talked about what happens when you do it incorrectly. So that's a criticism. Told parents what would happen if they screwed up, but not how to avoid screwing up. So we'll move on to this first stage, which I've already mentioned, and this is the oral stage, and everybody's pretty familiar with this. And of course, Freud clearly had an oral fixation himself. Even after all the oral cancers, he still couldn't quit smoking those cigars. So the primary erogenous zone is the mouth. And the mouth at this age, so babies, reduces biological drive, and babies also get pleasure from this. They like to suck on things. They like to put toys in their mouth. Basically, they learn about the world through their mouth. And Freud believed that that mouth remains an important erogenous zone. The developmental task is weaning. So the idea is that we want the libido to move on from the mouth as a primary erogenous zone. And so the child has to learn to eat solid food and get away from nursing or get away from bottle feeding. So that's what parents have to do. Now, of course, it's done wrong. So here are a couple of the problems. First of all, when parents overindulge their child. So whenever a child cries, they whip out the bottle or they shove a pacifier in their mouth. The child can become oral dependent, or oral passive is another way to think about it. So what happens is that the child learns to overdo oral pleasures, and these become adults who do the same thing. So these are adults who smoke, and maybe they drink and like to chew gum and chew on things. So really the fixation results from having just too much stimulation in the oral area. So this next picture is kind of an interesting one. This is my son. He was about, a year here, something like that. He loved his pacifier. And I like this picture because it's sort of the perfect cross between the oral stage and the next stage in Freud's theory, the anal stage. Boy loved his pacifier, and he loved playing. He'd crawl in there and we'd go to find him, and there he would be playing with the plunger and unrolling the toilet paper. So not the most fun thing for a parent to encounter, but this is where kids are at in that stage. Okay, so what about parents who don't indulge their child enough, who take away the pacifier too soon or take away the bottle? These are people who can become orally aggressive. This results from frustration because they weren't allowed to indulge the oral region enough. Sometimes they're called orally sadistic. So these are people, they become kids and adults who bite like this child. They use their mouth as a weapon, as a way to think about it. And as people get to be adults, we don't bite people anymore, I hope, when we're adults, but you may engage in symbolic oral aggression. So you may be really sarcastic or pessimistic. You may really like jokes that insult people. So essentially using your mouth as a weapon because you did not get enough indulgence in the oral stage as a child. So think about that. Okay, so this lasts till about age 1, and then kids move on to the stage that people just don't understand this, the anal stage. These are toddlers, 2 to 3-year-olds, and the primary erogenous zone becomes the anal area. So people are like, how can little kids derive pleasure from this? Which is what Freud says. So the libido shifts from the mouth to the anal region, and kids get pleasure they get an actual feeling of physical pleasure from the retention and the expulsion of feces. So kids learn to hold it in, or they learn to let it out. They are learning control over their own bodies is what this symbolically means. And it feels good. That's why sometimes when you're trying to potty train your child, and you may find them like hiding behind furniture, trying to hold it in. For Freud, that's actually a feeling of pleasure they have, that control. So psychologically, the important part of this is that this is really the very beginning of self-control and mastery. And of course, the developmental task is toilet training to get the libido to move on. Kids have to be toilet trained. But this control thing also means that kids learn for the first time they can control their parents here. So think about it. When you're trying to toilet train a child and they make it to the potty on time, we shower them with praise. We're so excited. So kids kind of learn that what they're doing in that area is really important. And if kids don't make it to the potty in time, and they soil their diaper, their underclothes, then parents are disappointed and unfortunately sometimes punishing. So toilet training is a huge psychological undertaking for kids. Okay, so what happens when this goes wrong? Problems. Problems can result for having an anal retentive personality. I know you've all heard of this term before. Sometimes we'll say, oh, you're so anal, and you mean they're anal retentive. Anal retentive personality comes from frustration, comes from feelings of frustration. So as adults, uh, excuse me, let me backtrack here. These are parents who were pretty tough about toilet training. So kids were punished if they didn't make it. They were held to strict standards. These might be parents who expected too much. One of the things I see sometimes is that people try to toilet train their kids too soon because it's convenient for them. They get tired of diapers, they get tired of changing all that. Kids will be ready when they're ready. Some kids are ready when they're 2. Some kids aren't really ready until they're 4. And you can introduce them to the potty, but there's not a whole lot you can do otherwise. But if you're really tough and punishing on it, you may end up with a person who is anally retentive because they have learned to hold it all in. See if you think about it. So if they're being punished for not making it, they are learning to symbolically hold it all in. So as adults, these people are obsessive, they are stingy, they are very clean and fussy because that's what's been demanded of them when they're kids. At least this is according to Freud. So on this cartoon, I can't tell who's speaking. I think the therapist is speaking. Is anal retentive hyphenated? So yes. Okay, what if you're a kid whose parents are either real loosey-goosey about toilet training? Yeah, if you make it to the potty, great. If not, great. Or they just shower you with praise. And so what you learn is that everything your body produces is really important. You could end up being an anal expulsive individual. And this results usually from overindulgence. So parents praise the kid for bowel movements, and kids learn that this is the way they can control their parents. They can make their parents really happy or really upset by what they do. And so as adults, these are people that are messy, they're sloppy, they are cruel, they can be very disorderly, and that's come from symbolically just letting it all out and learning that it's okay to let it all out. So that's something to think about. The next stage is the big one, psychologically, for Freud. This is really the stage that's the most important and has the most potential to have a lot of impact on a person's life. And that is the phallic stage. So we're talking about preschoolers here, 3 to 6, and the erogenous zone becomes the genital area. And this is a time when kids become very curious about anatomical differences. They examine their own genital area. They're curious about others. This is the time when gender identity starts to become a bit more congealed. And the dominant conflict here has a lot to do with sex roles. Now, I want you to remember that back when Freud put this theory together, this was in Victorian Austria, sex roles were very strict for males and for females. They did not have the concepts of gender diversity that we do now. So please keep in mind when you think about how dated this part of his theory is. It's because he was a product of his times. So the dominant conflict here is the child's feelings for their parent, and specifically the opposite sex parent, and then their feelings toward the same sex parent. And again, this was a time when traditional families, traditional mother and father, I should say, was pretty much the norm, and that's what he founded his theory on. So the main conflict is what Freud called the Oedipal Complex. The Oedipal Complex is a general term that talks about a child's unconscious desire to possess the opposite sex parent and do away with the same sex parent. So according to Freud, children develop an unconscious need to marry, have children with, possess their opposite sex parents. So little boys fall in love with their mommy, little girls fall in love with their daddy, and they want to get rid of the same sex parent. The process is a little bit different for boy and girl, so I'm just going to quickly go through how different these processes are. If some of this goes by you, just rewatch the tape or read a little bit more in your book. To me, this is just the most fascinating part of his theory. And of course, it's based on Greek mythology, if you have any familiarity with it, the Oedipus Rex story. So we'll start off for boys. This psychological process is called the Oedipus Complex. So the Oedipal Complex is the general term, and Freud called the Oedipal Complex how it works for boys and girls, and then another person later on gave a different name to girls, which we'll get to. So for the Oedipal Complex, I'm going to talk about this in terms of a process here. So first of all, when little kids are preschoolers, so we're talking about boys here, they love their mom and they want to get rid of their dad because in their view, the dad is the one who possesses mom and he's kind of in the way of them being able to have the mother. But the little boy at the same time is very aware that he is inferior to dad. Dad is bigger, dad is stronger, dad has a lot of ability to do harm to the boy. And so the Oedipal complex itself is the boy's desire for the mother and wish to get rid of the father. But little boys are noticing that they have something that girls don't. And so at an unconscious level, little boys think that girls were also born with a penis, but they were castrated when they were young. And so at an unconscious level, the boys are afraid that they will also be castrated. And in particular, if they let dad know, if dad finds out about their feelings for mom, then dad could castrate them. So that's where this castration anxiety comes from. Again, it's unconscious. You're not going to see a little boy running around holding himself afraid that dad's going to cut it off. It's just not going to work. It's not going to work that way. It's all unconscious. What the little boy is aware of is that he loves his mother and dad's in the way, and what's he going to do about that? So the castration anxiety is a real fear. So to appease the father and prevent him from castrating him, he begins to identify with the dad. So he tries to dress like him, talk like him, follows him around, does activities with him, kind of as a way of preventing the father from knowing about his feelings for the mother. And as part of this, so he's identifying with the father, as part of this, he adopts dad's values and a sense of right and wrong. So he adopts dad's superego. So the end result of this is that the boy resolves the Oedipal complex by becoming like the father and developing a similar superego as the father. So the superego comes from the parent, most specifically the same-sex parent in Freud's theory. So that's how the process works in healthy people. Now, what about unhealthy people? What if boys don't resolve the Oedipal complex, or they've got a father that they don't identify with to some extent? Well, there are some negative things. A failure to resolve the Oedipal complex results in grown men, with some undesirable personality characteristics. They are brash, vain, ambitious, and if the father was particularly harsh and strict and punishing, these can be boys who have just a heightened feeling of castration anxiety and excess guilt and a heavier superego. So these are boys that are really afraid of their father, have probably been punished a lot, and so they just feel scared for the most part. This is a picture of Freud just before his death with his wife, and he's, I imagine, in quite a bit of pain at this point, taken in London, looking pretty somber. Okay, so for girls, it's actually more complicated, and part of that is because, as you heard in the film, Freud didn't really understand girls. He called women the dark continent. So he essentially formed his theory from his female patients. He didn't have great insight into them, so he just listened to some of the things he talked about, and this is what he came up with. It starts off very similarly. The love object choice is the mother. So little girls love their mothers. They're very attached to them. It's not a sexual love where they want to, have kids with them, but they're just very attached to their mothers. At the same time, little girls are discovering that boys have something that they don't, and they develop a penis envy, because for Freud, his theory is what we call phallocentric. He definitely believed in the superiority of the male organ. He didn't even try to hide that fact. So he just assumed that all women had penis envy. We heard a little bit about that in the video we watched. At the same time, in addition to this, little girls develop an anger at their mother because they assume that they were born with a penis and their mother castrated them to look like her. So in a way, the mom was enacting revenge for not having her own penis by castrating her daughter. So this instills anger in the little girl that mom castrated her, and that intensifies her desire and love for her father because he has the valued organ and can provide a child, which is kind of a penis substitute. I know it's so twisted, but just absolutely fascinating. How he came up with this is just incredible. So what ends up happening is that there isn't really a great resolve. So unlike boys who are highly motivated to emulate their father, little girls don't have that. They're mad at their mom. I mean, mom's already done the worst thing that she possibly can to them. What more can mom do to them? So they have a huge desire to emulate her. So they have a weak motivation to resolve the Oedipal complex, or the Electra complex, excuse me, and thus develop a weak superego. Freud believed that women had a weaker superego because they were not as motivated to resolve the Oedipal complex, the Electra complex for them, because of their anger at the mother. Now, this translates into the fact that women have a weaker superego translates into some personality characteristics that he felt pretty much all women had. The effects of the incomplete resolution of the Electra complex were this. First of all, he said many women had what he called a masculinity complex. These are women who do not assume a traditional role of getting married, having children. They don't assume the traditional female role. And he thinks that they're trying to be like men, and really they want the power of men. So they're still striving for that male superiority. And Freud sees these women as neurotic, those who have a masculinity complex. He also finds that women have feelings of inferiority towards men, to men for the rest of their life. And in fact, women also have a lot of contempt for other women. He said that women don't like other women because they don't like themselves. They feel inferior because they don't have a penis. They're inferior to men. And so other women are inferior as well. And this is considered kind of normal, actually, for Freud. This is how women are. And then women also possess this feminine sexuality. He believed that women in general, because they were trying so hard to get a penis substitute for themselves, were seductive, they were naive, they were very flirtatious. So all three of these very unflattering characteristics he attributed to women as a result of that incomplete Oedipal complex resolution. Okay, so after the completion of the Oedipal complex, as kids start to emerge toward grade school, get out of preschool, little kids are tired. That's psychologically a heck of a lot for kids to go through. And so the next stage that Freud posited was a longer stage, like all the elementary school years. He called it the latency stage. And he said at this point, the libido moves out of the body, doesn't focus on an erogenous zone. The libido focuses on non-sexual activities. So kids focus their energy on friends and sports and school and non-sexual kinds of things. This is prior to puberty. And there's also been some speculation by some authors that Freud was kind of tired too after coming up with this phallic stage. And so this was sort of a resting stage for him too, that nothing really much went on. And then finally, the last stage, the genital stage, from 12-ish to about puberty to the end, the libido moves back to the genital area, so the genitals become the erogenous zone. This lasts for the rest of the life. Not that he's saying that adults are like kids going through puberty. They're not, but they don't do any more real psychosexual developing after this stage. So the genitals are the erogenous zone, and the kind of burgeoning puberty leaves adolescents start to get ready for more adult sexuality with others as they get older. And then again, he didn't say a whole lot about this. So when you look at his theory, all the action takes place before you're 5 or 6 years old. All the major psychological kinds of happenings and development occurs during this time. And so if things go wrong, which they're kind of bound to in his theory, then that's going to affect people for the rest of their life.